In the annals of history, some figures seem almost to have been made by fate, granted an inevitable place at the center of their era, standing as towering symbols of power and conquest. But for the man who would later come to define the East with his might, the path to greatness was anything but destined. If history had a script, he was supposed to be a mere footnote, a minor player in a larger drama. But, in the end, it would be his defiance of destiny itself that would carve his name into the world's memory. There was nothing predestined about the rise of this conqueror. No ancient prophecy foretold his greatness, nor did the stars align in his favor. Instead, his ascent was the product of relentless will, calculated ambition, and the unwavering determination to create a legacy against all odds. Born into a world that seemed determined to break him, his beginnings were anything but promising. The land he hailed from was fractured, riven by warlords, shifting allegiances, and a growing sense of hopelessness. His family was no different. They, too, were caught in the tide of societal collapse, struggling to survive amid the chaos. From an early age, the boy learned that life was a series of choices between survival and surrender. While others around him were content to settle into the life handed to them, he began to see beyond the immediate struggles. Even as a child, his mind was constantly churning with ideas, strategies for overcoming not just the personal adversities, but the looming political turmoil that was consuming his world. What was remarkable about this young boy was not just his raw physical strength, or even his quickness in learning the arts of war, but the quiet force within him, the unshakable belief that he could change his fate. The world was a harsh and unforgiving place, and it seemed that no one was ever rewarded for simply being born into the right circumstances. His early years were a blur of conflict, with the specter of violence hanging over his family and village. His people lived in a fragile peace, but one that could be broken at any moment by the whims of the rulers and warlords who controlled the region. The power structure was rigid, and it seemed as though there was little chance for someone born on the margins to break through. Yet the boy saw the cracks in this system, the weaknesses that no one else dared to challenge. He studied his surroundings with a quiet intensity, learning to navigate the dangers of his environment with caution, but also with a growing sense of purpose. While others around him played their part in a fractured society, he began to see himself as something more than a passive participant. Even as a teenager, he had already begun to formulate his vision, a vision that would one day alter the very landscape of the East. But no dream, no matter how powerful, can be realized without obstacles. And for this young warrior, the greatest challenge would come not from the battlefields, but from the forces of tradition and power that surrounded him. His rise would be opposed at every turn, not just by his enemies, but by a world that had long been governed by a rigid set of laws, practices, and customs. The powerful warlords and nobles were entrenched in a system that worked for them. To upset that balance was no small feat. The established empires saw him as a mere nuisance, an anomaly in a world that had already been divided among the powerful. They dismissed him as nothing more than a fleeting threat, but in doing so, they underestimated the resolve of a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his ambitions. His early battles were not won with the force of a superior army, nor did they come through the conventional means that the established powers had relied on for centuries. Instead, he relied on a combination of sheer tactical brilliance and a deep understanding of the political landscape. He knew that strength alone would not bring him victory. He understood that the key to success lay in his ability to manipulate the complex web of allegiances, to make the right allies at the right time, and to strike when the moment was most opportune. His enemies, caught in their own complacency, failed to see that the young warrior was more than just a threat to their power. He was a force of nature, quietly waiting for his moment. But it wasn't just his intellect and strategy that set him apart. It was the fierce, unrelenting will that he brought to every battle. There were no second chances for him. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, and that each victory brought him closer to a larger confrontation with the very powers that ruled the East. His initial victories were small, skirmishes here, raids there, but each one carried an unmistakable message. He was not to be ignored. He began to build a reputation, not just as a military leader, but as someone who was capable of striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. Yet, despite his growing power, he never let his ambition overtake his clarity of purpose. He knew that the path he walked was one fraught with peril, and he steeled himself for the inevitable escalation that would come. As his influence grew, so too did the stakes. What had begun as a series of small, calculated moves soon turned into a movement, a tide of change sweeping across the East. The established powers, who had once dismissed him as a nuisance, now found themselves in a race against time. They saw the growing unrest among the people, the wave of support that was beginning to swell behind his cause. They could no longer afford to ignore him, but in trying to stop him, they only created a powerful force that was more determined than ever to see his vision realized. The escalation was rapid. Each battle, each confrontation, pushed him closer to his ultimate goal. With each victory, he grew bolder, more confident in his abilities. But as his power increased, so too did the pressure. His enemies, once content to ignore him, were now out for blood. They sent their armies to crush him, confident that they could easily overwhelm him. But the young warrior, who had already proven his ability to turn the tide of fortune, would not be so easily defeated. The turning point came when the very forces of nature seemed to conspire against him. A massive army, far larger than anything he had ever faced, descended upon his stronghold. It seemed as though this would be the moment when everything would crumble. His forces, though formidable, were vastly outnumbered. His position seemed hopeless. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming threat, he did not falter. Instead, he did what he had always done. He trusted his instincts, his understanding of the terrain, and his ability to read the movements of his enemies. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of military strategy. Against all odds, he emerged victorious, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of defiance against the tyranny of fate. It was this victory that would mark the beginning of his true rise. No longer a mere figure on the margins of power, he was now a force to be reckoned with. His enemies knew that he was no longer someone they could easily ignore or dismiss. He had shattered their expectations and turned the very idea of fate on its head. From that moment onward, his path was set. He would continue to fight, to build, and to conquer, reshaping the East in his image. And while the world would continue to question his legitimacy, he would remain undeterred, knowing that his greatest strength lay not in the power he held, but in his refusal to accept the limitations that the world had placed on him. The path of a conqueror is never a straight one, and for this man, every step toward greatness was fraught with uncertainty. As the movement he had set in motion began to gather momentum, so too did the challenges that accompanied it. No sooner had he tasted the thrill of victory than the weight of leadership became palpable. The enemies who had once laughed at his audacity were now hunting him with renewed focus, and the stakes were higher than ever. The young warrior, who had once stood alone against overwhelming forces, now found himself caught in the complicated dance of empire building, where every alliance, every decision, had consequences that rippled through the fabric of history. The internal tension was palpable. Though his forces had proven their mettle on the battlefield, the real test of his strength had yet to come. Leading an army to victory was one thing. Governing the vast territories that came under his control was an entirely different matter. With each victory, new lands were acquired, new people were brought under his rule, and with them came new complexities. The young conqueror quickly discovered that his battle for survival was not just one against foreign armies or rival warlords. It was a battle to maintain control over the lands he had claimed and to forge a sense of unity among the disparate peoples who now owed allegiance to him. Initially, his strategies had been purely military, focused on defeating his enemies in battle and securing key territories. But as his power grew, the complexities of governance became apparent. He was not just a warrior now. He was the ruler of a kingdom, a leader whose decisions would shape the lives of millions. It was one thing to inspire men to fight for a common cause, but another entirely to manage the diverse needs of a population that spanned vast geographical regions. Each new territory brought with it its own customs, languages, and power structures. It was no longer enough to rely solely on force. To secure his rule, he needed to master diplomacy, to wield the sword of leadership with as much precision as he had wielded the sword of battle. The challenge was immense. But what set him apart was his ability to adapt, to learn from each new experience. Where others might have faltered, he found new paths. He knew that his strength lay not just in his military prowess, but in his ability to think several steps ahead, to anticipate the moves of both his enemies and his allies. He began to surround himself with advisors, wise men and strategists, diplomats and former rivals, each of whom offered a unique perspective on the challenges he faced. It was a calculated move on his part, a recognition that true power was not just about dominating others, but about creating a system in which different forces could work in tandem for a common purpose. Yet, even as he sought to solidify his control, there was a sense of unease that hung over him, a gnawing doubt that even his growing empire could not shield him from the unpredictable forces of fate. As his power grew, so did the number of enemies who sought to undermine him. They were not always the warlords and generals who had once fought him on the battlefield, but now he found himself facing a more insidious threat: internal dissent. Even among his closest allies, there were whispers of rebellion, a growing sentiment that perhaps it was time for a new ruler, one who could restore order in a time when the Conqueror's methods seemed too harsh, too unpredictable. His enemies within were often more dangerous than those outside. The shifting dynamics of court politics, the hidden agendas of those who stood by his side, all threatened to destabilize the very foundations he had worked so hard to build. But for all the uncertainty, one thing remained constant: his vision. He knew that the kingdom he had created was not yet complete, that it was fragile and in need of constant attention. It was a fine line he walked between forging a new empire and preserving the one he had already established. To allow his power to slip, even slightly, would invite not just rebellion, but the complete collapse of everything he had fought for. His mind, once focused solely on battle strategy, now turned to governance with the same intensity he had applied to warfare. It was during this time that his leadership was truly tested. An external threat arose, one that seemed to come from nowhere. A coalition of former rivals, each representing a different region of the East, united in a bid to wrest control from him. These were men who had once been his enemies, but who now saw in his growing power a threat to their own interests. They knew that the time had come to challenge him, not just on the battlefield, but in the very heart of his empire. The warlords were not only seeking to take his territories, they sought to break the spirit of his people, to show that his empire was nothing more than an illusion of power, a fragile construction ready to be torn down. The challenge was immense. His forces, though battle-hardened, were stretched thin, and the resources to fight this new war were limited. For the first time since his rise, the Conqueror found himself at a crossroads, unsure whether he could hold his empire together. The weight of leadership, the constant balancing act between diplomacy and warfare, between internal control and external aggression, pressed heavily on him. But once again, he did not falter. It was in moments like these that his true brilliance came to the fore. He understood that this was not just a battle for land or power. It was a battle for the very soul of his empire. If he was to win, he would need to call upon every ounce of his military genius, every lesson he had learned over the years, to outmaneuver his enemies. The war that followed was a long and brutal one, marked by a series of tactical maneuvers that would come to define his leadership. Though outnumbered and facing increasingly desperate odds, the Conqueror proved to be a master of psychological warfare. He exploited the weaknesses of his enemies, sowing confusion and doubt within their ranks. The coalition of warlords, once united by a common cause, began to fracture under the pressure of his relentless tactics. One by one, they began to crumble, their alliances dissolving as their forces were scattered. For the Conqueror, however, this victory came at a personal cost. The toll of the constant battles, the endless struggles to maintain control, began to weigh heavily on him. He was no longer just a man of action, a warrior charging in a battle. He was a ruler, carrying the burden of thousands of lives, responsible for the fate of an entire people. It was a burden that only deepened as the war raged on. But in the end, his resolve held firm. The coalition was defeated, and his power was once again secure. His enemies, both external and internal, were vanquished, and his empire stood unchallenged. Yet, even as he basked in the victory, a sense of unease lingered. The Conqueror had triumphed, yes, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The challenges would only grow more complex, the stakes ever higher. His empire, though secure for the moment, was not invincible. In order to maintain his rule, he would have to continue adapting, continue evolving, and above all, continue to fight. The work of a conqueror was never truly done, and the price of power was a never-ending struggle against the forces that sought to tear it down. But as he looked out over the lands he had forged, he knew that he had come further than anyone had ever expected. And though the road ahead was uncertain, his vision had become a reality, one that would change the East forever. The weight of power has a way of changing a person, even those who rise to greatness through their own sheer will. As the Conqueror's empire grew, so too did the complexities of his role. He was no longer simply a warlord. He had become a figure whose every decision rippled through the lives of millions. The early victories that had once seemed so exhilarating began to fade into the background, overshadowed by the immense responsibility that accompanied them. He was now tasked not only with securing his empire, but with solidifying its future. The challenges ahead were no longer only about warfare or conquest. They were about governance, diplomacy, and the ever-present threat of discontent that simmered beneath the surface. For a man who had built his empire on the strength of his convictions and the might of his armies, the transition to a ruler of an established kingdom was jarring. What had once been a chaotic, ever-shifting series of battles had now transformed into a complex, multifaceted system that demanded every ounce of his attention. With each passing day, his time seemed consumed by the demands of the throne, with few moments to reflect on his personal desires or ambitions. Yet, through it all, there was one driving force that remained unchanged: his vision for the future of his people, his empire, and himself. But the path to a stable empire was not as straightforward as the road to victory. Even in the wake of his military success, there were those who sought to challenge his authority. The ancient structures of power, old feuds, rivalries, and loyalties, were deeply ingrained in the hearts and minds of those he ruled. His empire, though vast, was still fragile. The people who had rallied behind him during his rise were often driven by their own motives, not out of loyalty to him as a person, but because they had seen him as a force of change, an answer to the chaos that had consumed their lives for so long. To keep them united, he had to walk a fine line between inspiring loyalty and preventing revolt, all while maintaining the stability of a kingdom that had once been a mere idea, a distant dream. The pressures of leadership began to mount. His military campaigns had always been clear and straightforward: attack, conquer, defeat. But now he found himself in a different kind of battle, one where diplomacy, politics, and cultural sensitivity were just as vital as the strength of his armies. His empire, while powerful, was also diverse, composed of different cultures, languages, and traditions. The task of unifying such a vast expanse required more than military might. It required understanding the subtle nuances of human nature, the delicate dance of politics, and, perhaps most challenging of all, the art of compromise. There were moments when he questioned whether he was truly cut out for this role. The world he had created was far more complicated than the simple wars he had once fought. The balance of power within his empire was constantly shifting, and it seemed that every decision, every action, carried the potential for unforeseen consequences. Every ally he made had their own ambitions, and every enemy he conquered left behind a vacuum that could quickly be filled by someone else with designs on his throne. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, he pressed on. His instincts, honed through years of warfare, told him that to succeed as a ruler, he must remain as adaptable, as quick to respond to challenges as he had been on the battlefield. One of the most significant challenges to his rule came from within his own court. The empire's growth had not only brought him new enemies, but it had also exposed cracks in his own inner circle. There were those who, despite having benefited from his rise to power, resented the way he had secured his place at the top. Some were former allies who felt sidelined by his growing influence, while others were ambitious nobles who believed that their own claims to power deserved more recognition. This internal strife was the most dangerous threat to his empire. Unlike external enemies who could be vanquished in battle, the discontent within his court was far more insidious. The whispers of disloyalty, the quiet conspiracy among his closest advisors, were much harder to detect and more difficult to eradicate. The Conqueror's ability to navigate these treacherous waters became one of his defining traits. He learned to play the political game with the same skill he had applied to warfare. He began to cultivate a network of spies and informants, seeking out those who might be plotting against him, while also carefully managing the ambitions of those who had once been his greatest supporters. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required not only cunning and intelligence, but a deep understanding of human nature. He'd spent his early years learning the art of war, but now he was learning the art of rule. His battles were no longer fought with swords and shields, but with words and promises. One such battle came in the form of a rebellion that began to stir in the farthest reaches of his empire. It started as a series of small uprisings in remote provinces, spurred by the discontent of those who had yet to fully embrace the new order he had established. These were not the major cities that had already pledged allegiance to him, but the hinterlands, the forgotten corners of his domain where the power of the central government was weaker. The rebellion was sparked by a group of local leaders, men who felt their influence slipping away under the Conqueror's rule. They began to stir up sentiments of defiance, appealing to the people's sense of loyalty to their ancestral lands and traditions. The rebellion was not a well-organized force, but rather a series of disconnected, loosely aligned factions who shared a common cause, the desire to restore the old ways. At first, the Conqueror did not take these uprisings seriously. He saw them as insignificant disturbances, the kind of minor rebellion that was inevitable in any large empire. However, as time passed, the discontent spread. The unrest began to snowball, and soon it was clear that this was not a fleeting rebellion, but a serious threat to the stability of his empire. The local leaders who had instigated the unrest were skilled tacticians in their own right, and they quickly rallied a significant number of followers. The Conqueror realized that he could not afford to ignore this growing problem. He needed to act swiftly and decisively to prevent it from escalating into a full-scale war. But this was not a war he could fight with brute force alone. To truly quash the rebellion, he would need to understand the root cause of the discontent. He began to send emissaries to the farthest reaches of his empire, seeking to meet with local leaders and understand their grievances. Through these conversations, he learned that the rebellion was not simply about resistance to his rule. It was about the way he had consolidated his power. Many of the local leaders felt that they had been stripped of their autonomy, that the Conqueror's centralization of power had left them powerless. They had once ruled their own territories with relative independence, but under his rule, they were now little more than vassals. Realizing that a military solution alone would not work, the Conqueror made a bold decision. He would offer these leaders a chance to return to their former positions, provided they swore loyalty to him. It was a risky move, one that could either secure the loyalty of the descending provinces or further alienate them. Yet, he saw no other option. He had fought too long and too hard to let this rebellion destroy what he had built. In the end, his gamble paid off. The leaders, seeing an opportunity to regain some of their former power, agreed to his terms. The rebellion slowly dissipated, and the peace was restored. It was a victory, not through brute force, but through diplomacy and compromise. The Conqueror had once again proven that his greatest strength lay not in his ability to fight, but in his ability to adapt. As he looked out over the lands he had conquered, he understood that the work of a ruler was never done. Every victory brought with it new challenges, new complexities. But in this moment, he knew that his empire was stronger than ever before. It was not just a land of conquered peoples. It was a living, breathing entity shaped by his vision and his willingness to do whatever it took to preserve it. As the years passed and the conqueror's empire solidified, his understanding of power began to deepen. The road to greatness was no longer just about overcoming enemies or claiming new territories. It was about sustaining what he had built and ensuring that it endured for generations to come. He had fought countless battles, toppled long-standing dynasties, and reshaped the map of the East. But now, the challenge lay in maintaining unity among the very peoples he had conquered. His empire, though vast and powerful, was fragile, and he knew that its future depended not only on his strength, but on the loyalty of those who served under him. The empire had grown immensely since his rise, its borders stretching further than he had ever imagined. Cities, once independent, now fell under his rule, and the diverse cultures within those cities began to blend under his governance. What had once been a kingdom of fragmented tribes and warlords was now an empire, but with this unity came a new set of challenges. The people who lived within his empire had different customs, different religions, and, more importantly, different expectations of their ruler. The conqueror, who had once been able to rely on sheer force and military might to establish order, now had to rely on more subtle means to keep the peace. He had always known that military power alone would not hold his empire together. The struggle for power, once fought on the battlefield, was now being waged in the courts, in the chambers of his advisors, and in the hearts of his people. The conqueror had become not only a symbol of strength, but also the symbol of hope for those who had suffered under the reigns of past rulers. The lands he had conquered were now in a period of relative peace, but beneath that peace, the seeds of discontent still lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The once unified front was now showing signs of fracture. The great empire that he had fought so hard to create was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. For the first time in his rule, the conqueror found himself facing a crisis of governance that went beyond military strategy. The power structures of the old world, the entrenched elites who had once resisted his rise, were beginning to rear their heads again. Some had accepted his rule out of necessity, while others had been forced to swear loyalty due to his military dominance. But now, as the dust settled and the empire began to stabilize, these same elites, noble families, wealthy merchants, and powerful religious leaders began to push against the confines of the conqueror's authority. They resented the way in which he had centralized power, taking control of regions that had once been under their control, and they were now using their influence to undermine him from within. The conqueror knew that he could not afford to alienate these powerful factions. The fabric of his empire depended on their cooperation, and he understood that the delicate balance of power within his kingdom was fragile. His first instinct, as it had always been, was to crush those who opposed him, to use force to silence his detractors. But as he had learned time and time again, brute strength could only get him so far. The rebellion that had stirred in the outer provinces had taught him a valuable lesson. Power was not simply about domination. It was about understanding the pulse of the people, the underlying currents of discontent, and using that knowledge to steer the empire in the right direction. The more he thought about the situation, the more the conqueror realized that his greatest challenge was no longer on the battlefield. His true test had become the art of governance. Managing an empire that spanned so much land and included so many diverse peoples required more than just military expertise. It required wisdom, foresight, and, above all, patience. The conqueror, once known for his decisiveness and speed, now found himself facing a slower, more insidious kind of warfare. His enemies were not armies, but ideas, ideologies, and systems of power that had existed long before his rise. He began to change his approach. Instead of relying solely on military force, he sought to strengthen his empire through alliances. He reached out to influential leaders, those who had once been his enemies, offering them positions of power in exchange for their loyalty. He carefully selected governors for the newly acquired regions, ensuring that those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo were given enough authority to keep things stable. His ability to co-opt his rivals, to make them part of his empire rather than simply submitting them to his rule, became one of his greatest strengths. It was not enough to simply conquer and destroy. He had to build to create a lasting legacy. This new approach was not without its risks. The conqueror knew that by elevating his former enemies, he was also placing a great deal of trust in men who had once sought to destroy him. But he believed that loyalty, once forged through shared interest, was stronger than fear. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was a ruler in the truest sense, seeking to create a system of governance that could endure beyond his lifetime. However, as the conqueror navigated the delicate waters of diplomacy, he began to encounter another challenge, one that would prove to be just as daunting as any military conflict he had faced. The question of succession became increasingly important as the years wore on. The empire, though strong, would eventually need a ruler who could continue what he had started. And yet, there was no clear answer. The conqueror had no legitimate heirs, no son, no daughter who could inherit his throne. His rise to power had been born from conflict, and in that conflict there had been little room for personal life. The empire he had forged was not one that could easily be handed down. It was too complex, too volatile, to simply pass from one generation to the next without careful planning. The issue of succession was a source of great concern for him. He could not afford to leave the future of his empire to chance. A weak successor could undo everything he had worked for, and in the turbulent world of politics and power, the wrong choice could lead to civil war. He began to search for a solution, but it was not easy. The idea of passing his empire to a blood relative seemed unlikely, given that he had no heirs of his own. The alternative, choosing a successor from among his allies, his generals, or even his political rivals, was fraught with its own dangers. His closest confidants were ambitious men, each of whom had their own designs on power. To choose one would risk alienating the others, and that could destabilize the fragile alliances he had so carefully cultivated. It was a dilemma that weighed heavily on him. For a man who had once been focused on conquest, the issue of legacy was a constant reminder that the world he had fought to create could unravel just as quickly as it had been built. The empire was not a static thing. It was a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving, constantly shifting. And so, as he pondered his future, the conqueror began to realize that his true legacy would not be defined by the borders of his empire or the victories he had won, but by the system he had put in place, the stability he had created in a world that had once been ruled by chaos. But even as he worked to secure his empire's future, there was an undeniable sense of weariness that settled over him. The weight of leadership, the constant pressure to maintain control, was beginning to take its toll. His body, once strong and resilient, now ached from the years of battle, of endless campaigning, of the unyielding demands of the throne. His mind, too, was showing signs of strain. The brilliant strategist who had once outthought his enemies now found himself exhausted by the never-ending task of ruling. He had built an empire, but the empire was also beginning to erode the man who had created it. In these moments of doubt, the conqueror would often reflect on the past, on the young man who had once defied destiny, who had risen from nothing to become the ruler of the East. He had known then, as he knew now, that his success had come not from the hand of fate, but from his own will. But the price of that success, the toll it had taken on him, was becoming more apparent with each passing year. As he stood at the pinnacle of his power, he could not help but wonder, had he sacrificed too much along the way? The conqueror's empire, once a dream etched in the blood of countless battles, had now become a living reality, a vast and intricate network of regions, cities, and peoples. But as the years passed and the empire solidified its hold over the East, the very thing that had once been the driving force of his rise, his unyielding ambition, began to reveal its darker side. The power he had so fiercely sought now weighed heavily upon him. What had been a kingdom forged through fire and blood had grown into something more complex, something that demanded far more than the ruthless, immediate action of the warrior. Now, as the empire stabilized, the conqueror found himself grappling with a new kind of challenge: the complexities of legacy. His success had come at a cost. The empire was strong, its borders secured, but the very foundation upon which it was built was fragile. The conqueror knew that power, once seized, must be carefully preserved, nurtured, and protected. There were no guarantees in this world, and even the most dominant rulers could fall from grace if they failed to see the subtleties of governance and the delicate web of alliances that kept an empire intact. His once clear and focused vision began to blur under the weight of leadership. The pursuit of power had always been singular, but now the question that haunted him more than any military foe was what would become of the empire once he was gone. In his earlier years, the conqueror had been driven by an almost singular desire for victory, a relentless force that propelled him from one battle to the next. He had been defined by his ambition, and his strength lay in his ability to bend the world to his will. But now, as a ruler, his ambition had taken on a different form. The battles he fought were no longer for territory or dominance. They were battle for the soul of his empire. The land he had conquered was vast, its people diverse, and his role as emperor required a different kind of strength, one of patience, diplomacy, and foresight. The complexity of leadership began to take a toll on the conqueror's psyche. The demands of empire building, once exhilarating, now felt like an unending cycle of struggle. Every decision, every move he made, had far-reaching consequences. The nobles, the generals, the distant governors, all depended on him, and each sought his favor or vied for more power. The internal politics of the empire, once a distant concern, now became a daily reality. These men, many of whom had once been his enemies, were no longer straightforward figures. They had become players in a game of intrigue and manipulation, constantly testing the conqueror's resolve, pushing the boundaries of his rule. His once straightforward military victories had now turned into a series of complex negotiations, delicate alliances, and subtle compromises. But as the challenges of leadership mounted, there was one issue that seemed to weigh most heavily on the conqueror's mind: his legacy. The empire was now at crossroads. Its power was unquestioned, its military might unmatched, but the very nature of its existence seemed precarious. The conqueror had no direct heirs, no bloodline to carry on his name, and this absence created a sense of unease that he could not shake. His rise to power had been forged through war and conquest, but what would become of the empire when he was no longer there to guide it? Who would lead the people he had fought so hard to unite? The question of succession had always been in the back of his mind, but as time wore on, it became an ever-present specter, haunting his thoughts. It was a dilemma that was impossible to escape. The empire could not afford to fall into disarray after his death, and yet, the very nature of the empire made it impossible to find a successor who would be universally accepted. Those who had been closest to him, his generals, his ministers, even his most trusted allies, were all powerful men in their own right. But each one of them had their own ambitions, their own designs on power. The conqueror could not afford to elevate any one man above the rest, for it would risk fracturing the fragile unity of his empire. So, the conqueror did what he had always done in the face of uncertainty. He sought answers through action. He began a careful search for a successor, a process that would involve not just selecting someone capable, but someone who could unite the factions of his empire under a single banner. This was no simple task, for the conqueror had learned that loyalty, once gained, could easily be lost. His own rise had been the result of shrewd alliances and calculated moves, and now, as he sought to choose his successor, he understood that the same principles applied. He could not simply name an heir and expect the empire to follow. The empire was too vast, too diverse for such an approach. Instead, he would need to select someone who could command the loyalty of the military, the trust of the nobles, and the respect of the people. This person would need to be more than just a figurehead. They would need to be a symbol of the empire's future. The task was more difficult than the conqueror had imagined. He watched closely as the leaders of his empire began to jockey for position, each one subtly seeking favor and attempting to demonstrate their worthiness. The generals, once his comrades on the battlefield, now acted like rivals, each seeking to prove that they were the one most capable of leading the empire. His advisors, too, had their own ambitions, and each of them pushed for a particular candidate to be chosen. The politics of succession had become a game of shadows, where every word, every gesture had multiple meanings. It was a delicate balance, one that required the conqueror's full attention. Yet, as he watched the court in turmoil, a strange sense of isolation began to creep over him. In the early days of his rise, he had been surrounded by loyal men who had followed him into battle. They had shared his vision and had fought for the same cause. Now, the conqueror found himself surrounded by men who sought only their own advancement. His allies had become his rivals, his friends his enemies. The once vibrant, unifying force that had driven his empire was beginning to fragment into a series of competing interests. He had built an empire from the ground up, but now it seemed that the very forces he had brought together were slowly tearing it apart. Despite the political intrigue swirling around him, the conqueror knew that he could not afford to let his empire fall into chaos. His fear of a divided empire, one that could crumble under the weight of its own ambition, became his primary concern. He began to take more direct control over the succession process. He held secret meetings with his most trusted advisors, taking steps to ensure that whoever succeeded him would be able to consolidate power quickly and efficiently. He could not afford to leave anything to chance. He needed to ensure that his legacy would endure, that the empire would not devolve into civil war or internal strife after his death. But even as he worked tirelessly to secure his empire's future, there was an ever-growing sense of weariness that began to take hold. The burden of leadership, once a source of pride and purpose, had become a constant strain. The conqueror, who had once been driven by the desire to conquer and expand, now found himself preoccupied with the preservation of what he had already achieved. The empire, which had once been a symbol of his power and vision, had become a source of anxiety, a reminder that even the greatest of empires could crumble under the weight of internal conflict and the passage of time. The conqueror found himself questioning the price of his success. The life he had built, the empire he had forged, had come at a great cost, not just in blood, but in personal sacrifice. The years of warfare, the endless battles, had taken their toll on his body and his spirit. He had sacrificed relationships, love, and even his own sense of self in the pursuit of power. And now, as he looked at the empire he had created, he wondered whether it had all been worth it. Had his unyielding drive for greatness blinded him to the more simple joys of life? Had he become so consumed with the need to build something that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live? As these questions consumed his thoughts, he was forced to confront the reality of his own mortality. The empire he had created, for all its strength and power, was ultimately fragile. And in that fragility, he saw a reflection of his own life, grand, imposing, but vulnerable. The future of the empire, like his own, was uncertain. And yet, as the shadows of doubt and weariness loomed, the conqueror knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would continue to fight, not just for his empire's survival, but for the legacy that would live on after him. The weight of leadership continued to burden the conqueror in ways he had never anticipated. Despite the empire's expansion and the consolidation of power, something deeper began to stir within him, an unsettling awareness that the structure he had built, however strong it seemed, was fragile beneath the surface. His earlier victories had given him confidence, had made him feel invincible, as though his will alone could overcome any obstacle. But with the empire now firmly in his grasp, he began to see the cracks in the foundation that threatened its stability. The battles he had fought to establish his rule had been external, against rival kings, warlords, and foreign armies. But the true challenge was not in defeating those who sought to take his throne, but in understanding the empire he had forged and the people within it. The deeper he looked into the heart of his reign, the more he realized that his vision for the future could only be realized if he confronted the complexities of the present. For all his military brilliance, the Conqueror had never been a man of subtlety. His rise had been marked by force, by his ability to wield power and bend the will of others. But now, in the seat of power, he found himself confronted by forces that could not be defeated with an army, forces that came from the hearts and minds of those he ruled. The nobles, the generals, the governors, each one had their own ideas about how the empire should function, about how it should be governed. It became clear to him that the success of his empire did not lie solely in his ability to win battles or expand territory. It lay in his capacity to govern, to unify these factions, and to create a system of power that would endure. The Conqueror had long relied on his instincts, on the gut feeling that had guided him through countless battles. But now, with the empire at its peak, he realized that his instincts alone would not suffice. He needed to be more than a warrior. He needed to be a statesman, a ruler who understood the complexities of governance. He had never considered the intricacies of statecraft when he was on the battlefield, and it seemed almost absurd to him now that the same principles that had made him a conqueror could apply to ruling an empire. The enemy was no longer an opposing force on the field. It was the very fabric of the empire itself, its diverse people, its complex politics, and its fractured alliances. He found himself forced to adapt, to evolve into something more than the man who had fought for dominance. This shift in his approach was not without its difficulties. The empire, despite its outward appearance of unity, was teetering on the edge of discord. The warlords and generals who had once fought under his banner now chafed under the constraints of his rule. They were no longer willing to simply accept his leadership. They demanded their share of power, their place in the empire. The once loyal men who had helped him win his victories now began to question the way he governed. They had grown accustomed to the freedom that came with battle, to the rewards that came with conquering new lands. Now, under his leadership, they found themselves constrained by the bureaucratic structures he had put in place. The Conqueror had been so focused on consolidating power that he had overlooked the dissatisfaction brewing among those who had helped him build it. As tensions mounted, the Conqueror found himself in a difficult position. The old ways, the ways of the battlefield, of the warrior, no longer seemed to serve him. He could not simply command loyalty by force. He had to win it through diplomacy, through compromise, through careful negotiation. But this was a skill he had never truly mastered. His entire life had been about forging his own path through strength and resolve, not about bending and accommodating those who sought to challenge him. He had conquered men with his sword, but now he needed to learn how to wield power without it. He began to recognize the gravity of his task. The empire was vast, its people diverse, and it was impossible for one man alone to control it all. The Conqueror had surrounded himself with men who were loyal to him, but loyalty, as he now realized, was never guaranteed. The noble families, the military leaders, even the provincial governors, all had their own ambitions. They had sworn allegiance to him, but their loyalty was often conditional, based on what they stood to gain from his rule. The Conqueror had underestimated the depth of their ambitions, and now, as they grew more powerful, he saw the dangers of this miscalculation. His approach to governance had been shaped by his experiences on the battlefield, where quick decisions, decisive actions, and overwhelming force were the keys to success. But now, in the halls of power, those same strategies seemed ineffective, even reckless. He had been able to defeat his enemies in battle, but could he defeat them in the core of politics? The Conqueror began to learn the nuances of courtly intrigue, the subtlety of alliances and betrayals, and the ways in which power was wielded in the absence of war. His days of commanding armies were increasingly replaced by nights spent in the company of his closest advisors, studying the intricacies of statecraft and governance. He could not afford to ignore the realities of power. As the political landscape shifted, so too did the nature of the threats to his rule. The threat of an external invasion, once the most immediate danger, now seemed secondary to the dangers that festered within the empire itself. Revolts, conspiracies, and rival factions threatened the stability of the empire more than any foreign army ever could. The conqueror realized that his true battle was not one of military conquest, but one of governance, of maintaining control over the empire without resorting to violence. As the political tension within the empire continued to rise, the conqueror found himself forced into difficult decisions. His attempts to appease the factions that threatened to destabilize his empire were met with mixed results. His efforts to elevate loyal generals and secure their allegiance only seemed to further fuel their ambitions. They began to see themselves as his equals, not his subordinates, and their demands for more power grew more insistent. The conqueror's attempts to negotiate were met with resistance, and he began to see that the empire was beginning to fracture. The sense of unity that had once defined his reign was now slipping away. But the conqueror, ever the strategist, refused to concede defeat. He knew that this new battle, was the most important one he would ever fight. It was not about territory, it was not about military dominance, it was about maintaining the legacy he had fought so hard to build. The empire could not survive without unity, and if he could not unite it, then his vision for the future would die with him. The conqueror, who had once relied on the sharp edge of his sword, now had to rely on the sharpness of his mind. He sought to regain control, but not through brute force. He began to cultivate new alliances, reaching out to those who had once been distant and unyielding. He offered positions of power, wealth, and influence in exchange for loyalty. He understood now that the key to maintaining power was not to dominate, but to co-opt, to bring those who might seek to overthrow him into the fold. He used his political acumen, honed through years of military campaigns, to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. One by one, he brought new factions into his camp, securing their loyalty and building a more stable foundation for his empire. But even as he consolidated power, a new wave of unrest began to take shape. The conqueror had learned the harsh lesson that power could not be held by force alone. It had to be earned, built on trust and compromise. But trust was fragile, and compromise was difficult to achieve in an empire as vast and divided as his. The empire was never a monolith. It was a patchwork of cultures, religions, and political factions, each with its own unique needs and desires. What united them all was his leadership, but that unity was beginning to show signs of strain. In the quiet moments, when the empire was still and the burdens of leadership felt heavy, the conqueror often wondered if he had been too ambitious, if his desire for power had blinded him to the simpler pleasures of life. He had gained the world, but at what cost? He had sacrificed so much, his family, his personal happiness, his own peace of mind, only to see that the empire he had fought for was far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The conqueror's journey had come full circle. The man who had once fought to create an empire, who had built his power with blood and iron, now found himself fighting to preserve that empire from the very forces he had once crushed. The battle for his legacy, for the future of the empire, had become his greatest challenge yet. And as he faced these new trials, he knew that the stakes had never been higher. The empire was not only his creation, it was a reflection of him, and its survival was tied to his own. As the conqueror's empire stretched further, its pulse became more complex, and with it, the burdens of rule grew heavier. What had once been a dream, fueled by ambition and the desire for glory, had morphed into a living, breathing entity. It was no longer just a collection of lands and people under his dominion, but a network of competing forces, cultures, and ideologies. And yet, in the midst of all this, the conqueror remained resolute, driven by the need to see his empire endure. But even the most steadfast ruler is not immune to the consequences of time, and the strain of leadership was beginning to take its toll on him in ways he had not fully anticipated. The challenges now were not those of expansion or conquest, but those of internal stability and legacy. His empire, though powerful, was now a delicate balance between tradition and progress, between the ambitions of his closest allies and the desires of the people. The question that had once haunted him, what would become of his empire after his reign? was now more pressing than ever. The Conqueror had spent much of his life in battle, living by the sword and leading with the might of his army. In those early days, it was a simple matter of conquering, of taking what was rightfully his through sheer force. But the empire he had built was too vast, its people too diverse for the old methods of rule to work. The complexities of governance, the subtleties of diplomacy had always been a distant concern to him, something he never fully engaged with. But as his empire solidified, the reality of leadership began to sink in. He was not just a conqueror anymore. He was an emperor, and his actions now had consequences far beyond the battlefield. The men who had once fought alongside him, the generals and commanders who had shared in the victories, were now beginning to challenge him in ways he had not foreseen. Their loyalty, once unwavering, was now starting to fray. They were no longer content to serve under him without question, no longer willing to remain in the shadows of his power. They wanted more. As his empire grew, so did the ambitions of those who had helped him build it. They were not just soldiers and administrators. They were now men of power in their own right, each with his own vision for the future of the empire. The Conqueror had been a man of instinct, of quick decisions and bold actions. He had never been one to hesitate, never one to second-guess himself in the heat of battle. But now, as the empire entered a new phase, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. The dynamics of power had shifted, and he could no longer rely on his old methods. He had always understood that power was gained through force, but now he was beginning to understand that power was just as easily lost through neglect, through failing to understand the subtle currents that ran through the hearts of men. His empire was like a living organism, its various parts constantly shifting and moving, and to maintain control, he needed to be attuned to every shift, every change. He could no longer afford to be a passive observer, merely reacting to events as they unfolded. To maintain the empire's cohesion, he had to be proactive, to anticipate the needs and desires of his people, his generals, and his nobles. The politics of his court, once a series of minor annoyances, had become the true battleground. Every decision he made now was met with scrutiny, with those around him jockeying for position and influence. The political alliances he had once forged with ease were now more tenuous, and every day, new rivalries and factions began to emerge. The very men who had once been his closest allies were now his greatest threats, and he had to learn to navigate these shifting alliances with caution. The Conqueror had spent so much of his life focused on the external threats to his empire that he had neglected the internal dangers. The risk of rebellion, of revolt, had always seemed distant to him, something that could be quelled by force if necessary. But now, he began to understand that internal dissent was far more dangerous than any foreign enemy. Revolts, conspiracies, and power struggles simmered beneath the surface, and the Conqueror realized that his greatest challenge was no longer the external enemies he had once vanquished, but the shifting allegiances of those closest to him. It was during this time that a more personal issue began to rise to the forefront of his mind, the question of his own mortality. He had spent so many years focused on the present, on the here and now, that he had never truly considered what would come after him. But as he grew older, as the weight of leadership began to take its toll on his body, he realized that the empire he had fought so hard to build would not last forever. The question of succession, which had once seemed so distant, was now an urgent matter. The Conqueror had no heirs of his own, no bloodline to pass on the throne, and this absence left him in a vulnerable position. His empire, though powerful, lacked the foundation of a lasting dynasty, and without a clear successor, it was at risk of falling apart after his death. The Conqueror knew that he could not leave the future of his empire to chance. He had spent his entire life fighting to secure his place in history, and he was not willing to let it all crumble after his death. But the choice of a successor was not a simple matter. His closest allies, his generals and ministers, each saw themselves as the rightful heir to the throne. And as they began to vie for power, the tension within the court grew palpable. The Conqueror found himself caught between his desire to secure the future of his empire and his recognition that the very men he had trusted to help him rule were now his greatest rivals. This new internal struggle was unlike anything he had ever faced. On the battlefield, he had always known who his enemies were. They were the men with swords drawn against him, the ones who sought to take what was his. But now, his enemies were not so easily identifiable. His generals, once his comrades in arms, had become his competitors. His closest advisors, those he had trusted with his secrets and his plans, were now the very ones who sought to undermine him. The very system of power that he had created had turned against him, and he was forced to grapple with a new kind of battle, one that could not be won with force. It was a battle of manipulation, of subtle moves and counter-moves, a battle that played out in the shadows of his court. The Conqueror began to see the intricate dance of politics in a new light. It was not just about winning battles, it was about managing relationships, about controlling the flow of information, about knowing when to act and when to wait. He began to understand the nuances of leadership in a way he never had before. And though it came with a sense of disquiet, he realized that this new kind of warfare required a different set of skills, ones he had never needed on the battlefield. He turned inward, reflecting on the choices he had made over the years. The men he had brought into his fold, the allies he had cultivated, were now the ones he had to keep close, but also at arm's length. The loyalty that had once been so easily obtained through shared victories and common goals now seemed fragile, easily shattered by ambition and greed. And as he looked around him, he realized that he could no longer trust the very people who had helped him build his empire. They were no longer allies. They were rivals, each one seeking to carve out their own future. But even in the midst of this struggle, the Conqueror could not forget the one thing that had sustained him throughout his rise, the desire for greatness. The empire he had built was not just a means to an end. It was a reflection of his vision, of his legacy. And he knew that if he could navigate these treacherous waters, if he could survive the intrigues of his court and the ambitions of his closest allies, then his empire would endure. It would live on as a testament to his strength, his determination, and his ability to overcome even the most insurmountable of challenges. And yet, the Conqueror also knew that the price of his ambition was steep. He had spent so many years building an empire, but in the process, he had lost much of what he had once valued. His personal life, his relationships, had been sacrificed in the name of power. He had alienated those who mattered most, those who had once stood by him. His dreams of glory had come at the cost of his humanity, and now, as the empire reached the height of its power, he found himself questioning whether it had all been worth it. The empire was strong, yes, but its strength came at a price. The Conqueror was no longer the young man who had fought to claim his place in the world. He was a ruler, burdened by the weight of his decisions, surrounded by men who would stop at nothing to secure their own futures. The empire, which had once been a symbol of his triumph, now seemed like a prison, its walls closing in on him. But even as the Conqueror faced these new trials, he knew that his fate was not yet sealed. There was still time to secure the future of his empire, to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and ensure that his legacy would live on. The empire he had built might be fragile, but it was still his. And as long as it was in his hands, he would fight to protect it, no matter the cost.